CCO nagad, kani koraha dagwadoa, kahiliga gitawa, come, idalena. Hello everyone, my name is Roy Boney Jr. I am glad to be here today. So let's get started. I'm going to be talking today about what I hope will be a fun topic. Cherokee graphic art, primarily in the form of comic strips, political cartoons, and comic books, or as graphic novels as some people may call them. I'll use examples from other artists and some samples of my own work. But first, I'll talk about early depictions of Cherokees in graphic art by non-Cherokees, and then move on to art by Cherokees ourselves. Uh, Comics can be a powerful form of art because the basic point of entry is pretty simple. You need a piece of paper, a pen or a pencil, or these days a smartphone or tablet, and an idea. From there, it can grow in complexity, especially when it comes to the mechanics of reproduction for publication. So while initially being condemned as lowbrow entertainment, cartoons and graphic novels these days have come to be seen as a very serious form of art, and even literature, with such major works as Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and it's about the Holocaust. With mice as the Jews and cats as the Nazis. Marjan Satrapi did a story about the Iranian Revolution called Persepolis. Then there's Joe Sacco's Palestine, which is about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And even more recently, there's the graphic novel series March, which is about the civil rights activist John Lewis, who recently passed away. And these are just a few examples of the kinds of stories that you can tell in this medium. They can be serious, funny, historical. I mean, there's endless possibilities here. So I'm going to start off with what comics scholar Scott McCloud cites as an early example of what he considers one of the first comic books. It was an indigenous creation, actually. It's the so-called Natal Codex. It's named after Zelia Natal, who first published the document. It is an illustrated epic tale on deer hide that tells the story of the warrior of 8 deer. It was created by indigenous Mesoamerican people around the 14th century. There are other examples of this kind of illustrated indigenous storytelling throughout world history, too. I would argue that one would consider the Lakota winter counts, which are tribal stories and records illustrated on hides, as being powerful precursors to modern indigenous graphic novel art forms too. So with that brief groundwork, I want to show a few images of Cherokees that were done by non-Cherokees to contrast that with works from Cherokee people. So here is an engraving by the famed illustrator William Hogarth. His work would become highly influential in the development of editorial illustration, modern comics, and political cartooning. So in June of 1762, a Cherokee delegation visited London. It caused quite a sensation among the British public. The Cherokees toured the city, dined with King George III, and even sat for portraits to be painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was one of the world's most renowned painters at the time. The Cherokees were like celebrities, visiting England, and the London press recorded their every move. So Hogarth captured some of the hoopla around the Cherokee visit in this engraving. The name of the engraving is The Times. So while the entire piece itself is primarily focused on British politics and society of the day, it does include this reference to the hype of the Cherokee visitors. Here's a detail of the previous slide that shows the Cherokee. So it says live from America. This was supposed to represent one of the Cherokee visitors in a cartoon caricature. You notice it's kind of what you would consider at the time. It's very stereotypical. It looks like the guy is holding some money bags and has some kind of drink around his on his belt. Some barrels behind him. It's saying a lot of bad things about Cherokees, but this is how a lot of people saw Cherokees back then. And it continues to this day. So that's why it's important we tell our own stories. But here's a lithograph depicting King Louis Philippe from France. He went into exile in North America for a few years, in the 19th century. And the king claims to have healed the Cherokee with an ailment, and his reward was supposedly to sleep with two of the most respected women in the community. This image was published in the journal The Caricature, which was a sort of a mad magazine of the days that parodied and satirized the French elite. This particular image was published in 1835, and it was done by the artist Damier. So if you think of that time frame, 1835 was when removal, it was about to happen. That's when the Cherokee Phoenix is being published. And Damier was an influential artist in the French Realism movement, and his images were published widely in his lifetime. So this image would have been seen by quite a lot of people. And note how the Cherokee women are depicted as very old, almost haggish monsters. So this is in keeping with keeping in line with the common savage image of indigenous people, so common from the era from which this would have been a very sizable European audience. So again, this is just showing how they would portray us, and this really not flattering. But moving on, this image is the historical caricature of the Cherokee Nation. The artist is unknown, but it's a satire, a political commentary about the Cherokee Nation at the time being divided up by the railroads, and it's an obvious reference to Jonathan Swift's story Gulliver's Travels, and the characters' encounter with the Lilliputian people. This image, again shows the dividing up of Cherokee lands from various parties, including railroad barons after the Civil War. So this image wasn't done by a Cherokee artist, but it's a good example of commentary on the indigenous history of the United States, even though it still does contribute to the ever constant changing or the othering of how we are portrayed by media. This was in 1866. So it was showing what happened to the tribe after the Civil War, which is it was a very devastating event for us as a tribe. So we have a long history of publication as Cherokee people, going back, with Sequoia's invention of the Silverberry. We get a Cherokee Phoenix published in 1828. So that's when our writing system was first published for the masses through a printing press. And there were several Cherokee newspapers that were published from Indian Territory prior to statehood. The Cherokee Phoenix features the very first piece of printed Cherokee graphic art in the form of Sequoia's Silverberry, which is an art form when you think about this in terms of design and art and graphics, and the Cherokee Phoenix masthead graphic, which you see here with the Phoenix, with the word protection above and the wings out. That's a piece of graphic art. So there's no direct documentation on who the artist was that made this engraving, but my research suggests that it might have been John Candy, who was a Cherokee journeyman printer on the Cherokee Phoenix, and he could have actually been the artist to make this image. It appears it was taken from an existing engraving and modified from what we might call clip art these days. So John Candy was working at the paper at the time as a printer, and he laid out the paper and did the typesetting and things. So having those skill sets, there's a possibility it could have been him. I don't know. I'm just kind of guessing, but it's interesting to think about that someone had to make that image for the Cherokee people. And more than likely, if I was a Cherokee artist, because the editor, Elias Boudnot, fought really hard to let the public know what, the Cherokee Phoenix is run by Cherokee people, despite criticisms that, people like Samuel Wooster and the white printer Isaac Harris were actually running the paper. That was a critique. Some enemies of Cherokee Nation lobbied at the time. That's not quite the case. This paper was ran by Cherokee people. John Candy was also hired to translate the paper, so he had a big hand in it. So my guess is he probably could have made that image, but we never really will know. But it's interesting to think about. So after the Cherokee Phoenix, there were a lot of other Cherokee newspapers that were published in Indian Territory. And it was in these publications that feature the first documented Cherokee cartoonists. Here's one of the earliest examples of a cartoon from the Telecoil Telephone newspaper in 1891. It shows G.W. Binge depicted as a bull being led by his handlers during the campaign for the chief's election that year. The artist is unlisted, but the paper was a Cherokee-produced publication. So again, this is more than likely a Cherokee cartoonist that made his image, lampooning the election of the time. So it was around this time, too, that the Cherokee Royal Roger Eubanks began working as a cartoonist. His father, William Eubanks, was a Cherokee translator for the Cherokee Advocate, as well as the creator of a version of Cherokee Silverberry shorthand for court reporting. So his son, Royal Roger Eubanks, he was an educated Cherokee. He was educated in Cherokee schools, and he graduated from the Cherokee Mill Seminary in 1897. After graduation, he taught school at Bragg's in the old Cherokee Nation and at the Cherokee Orphan Asylum. He returned to the Mill Seminary in 1901 as a teacher and became superintendent by 1905. So while teaching, Eubanks also pursued a career in art and writing. He began his illustration career while he was in his early 20s and began publishing cartoons in the Veneta Weekly Chieftain newspaper. Here's one of his cartoons that ran on July 9th, 1903. Like the previous cartoon I showed, this one skewers the election campaign for chief, which is always a ripe source for inspiration. It shows the candidates with snakes for bodies while the incumbent appears to be wearing a diaper. Often, Indian chiefs are portrayed as, stereotypical stoic, majestic figures, but left to our own devices, we do skewer our leaders pretty hard, and that's a long-standing tradition. So this is an example of that. Eubanks was a pretty prolific cartoonist. He continued his work in commercial art and began writing short stories and historical sketches, all which dealt with the subjects of Cherokee culture and history. As an artist and writer, he illustrated all his own stories. So here's another example of a cartoon he drew of Chief Rogers as a bandit cheating money from the Cherokee full-blood community. Eubanks pursued a career outside of Cherokee Nation as well. He lived in Chicago for a time and drew comics and cartoons for a syndication service. So again, lampooning our leadership has been a long-standing Cherokee thing. It still happens today, and it's happened as long as you can remember. So I just like to show this to show that it's nothing new, and it's kind of an interesting tradition, you might say. So I mentioned Eubanks worked and lived in Chicago for a time doing comics for a syndication service. So here's one of those comics. It's the cartoon of the industrialist John D. Rockefeller he did for the Chicago Syndicate. So in a profile about Eubanks that appeared in Cartoons magazine in 1920, he talks about how his enrolling in a course for applied cartooning improved his drawing skills. He eventually ended up illustrating for books and magazines across the United States, including working for the Bureau of Engraving in Oklahoma City, Boy's Life magazine, and various illustrated books on native stories from Harlow Publishing Company. Several unpublished cartoons of his were donated by his family to the Sequoia National Research Center in Little Rock, Arkansas, from which some of these images were provided. So if you ever want to study more about him and his work, you can go there and see the archives from his family. So while not a cartoonist himself, famed Cherokee cowboy, film star, comedian extraordinaire Will Rogers was quite the humorist. He published a lot of books about his musings on religion, politics, and life in general. In 1924, Rogers published the Illiterate Digest, a collection of his humorous writing. He employed the cartoonist Neil Collier to provide several cartoons throughout the book that prominently feature Rogers in various entertaining situations. This is the frontispiece of the book, which shows an example of the cartoon version of Will Rogers there. In the book, Rogers takes to task congressmen and presidents, his own family, even parades. So the cartoons perfectly complement his humor. But again, this is a great example of showing this art form, being combined with Cherokee writing and getting telling our story, our point of view, as opposed to what we looked at earlier with the two old Cherokee ladies in bed at the king, or the cartoon of for the British paper thing. This is a much different approach. So the first half of the 20th century took a huge toll on Cherokees with the loss of a stable government, and it wasn't until the 1960s when Cherokee publications began to make their comeback, as it were, such as in the Cherokee Speaker newsletter in the 1960s, which featured Cherokee language articles made from a new Cherokee typeset funded by donations from Cherokee readers. If you move forward a few decades, in 1968, there was a grassroots organization in Oklahoma called the Original Cherokee Community Organization, CCO, formed in opposition to Chief W.W. Keeler's administration. So, armed with the Cherokee language typewriter, the organization published various bilingual tracts and reports. In 1968, they published the Cherokee Report, and this features a full-page cartoon criticizing Keeler's connection to the Phillips Petroleum Company and his ill-fated attempt to build a railroad in Telecoil and take tourists to view the Cherokee Heritage Center, which is a living history museum built on the old side of the Cherokee Nation Female Seminary. So you can see there's Keeler going down the railroad with another bag of money, and you can see a guy in the background trying to stop him. But again, poking fun at our leadership and doing these political cartoons is a long-standing tradition among our people. By the mid-1970s, the Cherokee language entered a critical period of decline. More and more families were not passing down the language as they did before. So to combat this, the Cherokee Language Bilingual Education Program was formed. Headed up by Agnes Cowan, the program hired many first-language Cherokee speakers and tasked them with creating teaching materials. One of the more curious items on the program, though, is the publication of several Cherokee language adaptations of comic books from King Syndicate in 1975. In the 1960s, King tried to capitalize on the success of its newspaper comic strips by publishing them in comic book form. So 4 of these comics were translated into Cherokee, including Popeye, High and Lois, Beetle Bailey, and Blondie. So here are the covers from High and Lois and Popeye. You can see there's the Cherokee syllabary, it says C-O, Ole, Losi, so High and Lois. And for Popeye, it says Amayi, Edohi, which is kind of like water, wonder, or I guess, however you want to translate it. But you get the idea that they did these in the Cherokee language. So the comics were designed to aid in teaching Cherokee literacy, and they include both the English and Cherokee text, along with vocabulary lists at the back of the book. These books are distributed to various schools across the Cherokee Nation at the time. Here you see the interior of a couple of pages from Blondie, I believe here. Or actually, High and Lowest, excuse me. You can see the Cherokee version, and then you can see the English version. So you can compare the two and kind of start figuring out what they're saying, and start learning some of the language there. Another interesting project from this era were the Billy Bean books. There's The Adventures of Billy Bean and More Adventures of Billy Bean. And these 2 books were written by someone you're probably familiar with, Wes Studi, who went on to become the first, one of the first natives to win an Oscar. And these books are Cherokee stories about this character, Billy Bean, who goes on a lot of these crazy adventures. They were written by Wes and illustrated by Nick Forkiller. They were published in 1982 and 83. Nick Forkiller was from Stillwell, and he was an Army veteran. He worked as a commercial artist, but he passed away in 1999. But these books are full of these wonderful illustrations here. It's very fine graphic art, and it's great to see these. So if you have a chance to find some of these, you snatch them up because they're very beautiful. So here I'm going to switch gears a little bit. This is about the artist Robbie McMurtry. He was not Cherokee, but he claimed Comanche descent. And I mention this because, there are things that have come up when a person outside of a community chooses to tell a story about that community. There's a risk of getting it wrong and causing offense, and and there could be claims of misappropriation and things like that. But Robbie, he maintained close connections with several Cherokee people in the arts community in Northeast Oklahoma, including Bill Glass Jr., who is one of the most esteemed Cherokee artists working today, and he's a Cherokee National Treasure for his artwork. And Harry Ossowy, who is a Cherokee language speaker and artist, they were good friends with Robbie, who unfortunately passed away several years ago. But for a brief time, I had the pleasure of working with Robbie at his high school in Morris, and we had a project where we made Cherokee and Creek language animations with the students in the art class there. So Robbie and I bonded over our interest in comics and animation, and he had been making his own comics since the 1970s. So McMurtry, he researched the history of Ned Christie and vetted it with the members of the Cherokee community, including descendants of Ned Christie himself. So this book, Native Heart, is his 100-page graphic novel about the life of Cherokee patriot Ned Christie. The book includes dialogue written in syllabary, which he also vetted with Cherokee-speaking friends like Harry Ossowy. This graphic novel is a great example of someone outside the Cherokee community faithfully and respectfully telling one of our stories. And so you can see here the cover of the book and the page from the interior. You can see some of the dialogue is in the Cherokee syllabary. So this is a great example of someone being respectful to us and telling our story, and they're not Cherokee. So Robbie later did something similar in his 2011 graphic novel, The Road to Medicine Lodge, which is about the influential Cherokee trader Jesse Chisholm. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, McMurtry passed away in 2012, actually, and he is beginning stages of a new graphic novel about the Cherokee statesman Zeke Proctor. He referred to these graphic novel series as the underground history of Indian Territory. And what's interesting about this particular book, too, not only is parts of it written in Cherokee, he also has other languages like Osage, because Jesse Chisholm himself, if you don't know a lot about the man, he had this trail, this cattle trail, and he did a lot of trading with different people. So he was multilingual. He could speak many tribal languages in Spanish and English. So you think about him at the time, that was quite profound for someone to do all that. So Robbie felt the need to tell the story of this individual in graphic novel form. Here is the work of Aragon Starr. If you don't know her, she is creator of the popular Super Indian comic book series, and she is Kickapoo in Cherokee. Super Indian doesn't specifically address Cherokee themes, but it does serve as an example of a native artist having success on her own terms. The series serves up a healthy dose of humor as the lead character gains power by eating tainted government cheese, and it provides positive messages for native youth. The series makes social commentary on various issues like anthropologists, native humor, and political issues in Indian country. And so here again, you can see some of her artwork. One of the covers about the villain, the anthropologist. So who will stop the anthro? It's a pretty funny reading if you ever have a chance to check out her work. In 2013, the anthology series Graphic Classics, edited by Tom Pomplin, released Native Graphic Classics. So this is a graphic novel collection of various tribal stories written and illustrated by native and non-native creators. I illustrated the story in the book, How the White Race Came to America, which was an adaptation by Pomplin from Arthur C. Parker's Code of Handsome Lake, The Seneca Prophet. But Roy Roger Eubanks' work makes an interesting appearance in here. His short story, The Middleman, from 1911, Sturm's Oklahoma Magazine, which is about a shady land speculator, was adapted by the Yaqui writer John Proudstar, and non-native Terry Laban illustrated the book. So the story is about, again, a shady land developer who was taking advantage of Cherokee's dirty allotment era. So I think it's an interesting twist, I guess, to see a prose short story written by a Cherokee cartoonist adapted into a graphic novel format over 100 years later. Yeah, so again, this type of storytelling is enduring. It's neat to see how it endures and changes and with the times, and so now someone's adapted it from way back when. I just find that very interesting to see. As an artist myself, I've contributed, to several publications, including a cover featurette about the evolution of the Cherokee syllabary for Indian country today. This was later reprinted in many different sources, and it's had a lot of legs. But this picture here is actually, you can see a very large version of this story reprinted on the wall at Sequoia's Cabin Museum. So it is about the evolution of the Cherokee language from the printing press to modern technology. And again, telling these stories in this format is a great way to get your point across, because the visuals and the words come together and it makes it easy to understand. And people tend to enjoy it, and especially kids really like this. So it works for all ages, and it's a very effective way of getting points across to people. So this particular project here, Tales of the Mighty Code Talkers, is edited by Aragon Starr and Lee Francis IV. And those, I mentioned Aragon, but Lee is another friend of mine who is from New Mexico, and he operates a company called Native Realities, which publishes Native American comics and storybooks and all kinds of stuff. They do the Indigicon Comic Con now, so he's a very great friend of all of us, and I believe he's Laguna Pueblo. So the Code Talkers book is very special to me, as it's a collaboration with several of my friends. It's features 9 different stories of childhood code talkers from World War I to the Korean War. It was heavily researched and vetted by the communities represented in the book. And it was designed to be an accessible way to tell a little known historical aspect of our languages. So I did the cover illustration, but I also have a short story in it called Udelik Ajalak Deda Sanohe, which means we speak in secret, or we rearrange the messages, or however you want to put it. But it's about Cherokee code talkers in World War I, who, based on my best research and estimates, Cherokees were the first code talkers in World War I by about a month. Choctaws were often cited as the first, but Cherokees did this first in September, and the Choctaws came in October. So you can challenge me on that, but I believe that we were the first, and maybe I'm biased here because I'm Cherokee myself, but so I wanted to tell the story about Cherokee code talkers in World War I. So this is what this is about. Just as a few pictures here from the interior of the story, but it's based on some documents I found in the archives of Fort Benning, Georgia. So this is the first comic story of mine that features Cherokee syllabary dialogue, and that presented a unique challenge of, developing a Cherokee language comic book style font. So I'm a formally trained graphic designer, and I'm also interested in the evolution of our writing system. So I enjoyed this particular challenge, and so I developed a comic book style font that I could use for further publications if I want to do more of these, and I do have more in the pipeline. So here's just showing the original syllabary as it was printed in the 1820s versus the handwritten comic book style font that I made. Again, interesting challenge, but this is one of the things about when you're working in this medium. I like to imagine people making more of their own fonts, or even seeing us challenge the conventional Western storytelling format. Maybe we could even design specific color schemes and our own sound effects. Like, what would the Cherokee word for zap be, or for pow, or that kind of thing. So it's just something to think about for people that want to make their own stories using this kind of medium. So I'm going to kind of wrap up here, but I want to end by showing some examples of other Cherokee artists who are working in the comics vein. First, I'll start off here with some panels from Overcompensating. It's an ongoing webcomic by the Cherokee Nation citizen Jeff Rowland. He is a cartoonist and owner of Telecoil, a company that specializes in pop culture merchandising. He worked with cartoonists across the United States to merchandise their items. You might be familiar with some of the products that he sells, including t-shirts that have appeared on TV comedies such as The IT Crowd, and the merchandise featuring the so-called "This Is Fine" dog that is surrounded by fire, which has now become a popular meme. So he merchandises some of that stuff. So I've known Jeff my whole life. We both grew up in Locust Grove, Oklahoma. His mom was a full-blood Cherokee, but she married to a white guy, and Jeff. So he mines his half-blood Cherokee status for comedic effect quite a lot in this comic. And so here you can see him having a chat with the ghost of his grandpa, Leroy, and he's chiding him for not understanding Cherokee. So, he pokes fun at himself and kind of larger cultural things. And the comic's not all about Cherokee, but, sometimes it does appear. And so it is great to see him doing this, Here's a cartoon called, on the right with the skeletons, it's called Nigohila, which means forever. This is by the Cherokee artist Kelly Gonzales, who cites The Simpsons as a huge influence on her work. The cartoon is entirely in syllabary and it reads, "What are you doing?" And the other skeleton replies, "Nothing." And he says, "Me too." In the final panel, the conversation loops back to the beginning again. So it's kind of, some sly humor there. Kelly's co-founder of the Tulsa Ink Slingers Collective, and she's co-host of the OK Browns podcast, which is about indigenous topics in Oklahoma. She's also, very socially active political artist, working with Cherokee themes and uses language quite a lot in her work. Next to that, you see an image from the artist America Meredith, which appeared in the Turtle Island Liars Club book by Christopher Touton. These illustrated some of the stories, and I include this because it's not particularly a cartoon, but it is a really nice example of graphic art, and it has that quality to it. These pen and ink drawings. It's very in tune with what we've been talking about today. Here are a couple of pieces from the artist Tom Ferris, who is Cherokee and Oto, and he is referencing the work of pop artist Roy Lichtenstein, who famously incorporated comics into his fine art paintings. So in the set, you can see the woman's lamenting that I'm part Cherokee, but I can't prove it. So in the second image, she is thinking the same thing, but only in Cherokee syllabary. So these are companion pieces, and I think it's a great commentary on identity politics, and that's something that we struggle with as a community quite a lot across the board. So this is a very timely topic and imagery here. So again, wrapping up here, I think the world of Cherokee graphic novelists is still in its fledgling stages. There aren't a whole lot of comic book series about Cherokees by Cherokees. As we saw earlier, there's quite a lot of images of Cherokees by non-Cherokees, but most of it is pretty wrong. It's misinformed or stereotyped or something. So again, it's up to us to use this art form and tell our own stories and get our own images out there, because again, a lot of times people might see comics and cartoons as kind of throwaway culture, but often that's how cultures are defined. Sadly, sometimes by the larger world, they see these images in cartoons and in movies and things and books and whatever else, whatever kind of media these appear in now. That's how people form their ideas of communities now. So we got to tell our own stories and take our image back from the really just stereotypical version that a lot of people have. So I hope to see there's a growing interest in this in our community for this format, and I see it developing the community of Cherokee creatives telling stories across the spectrum from like quirky to personal, the comic, the tragic, and everything in between. So telling our own stories is the ultimate act of resistance and resurgence. So I leave you with one of my personal favorite pieces from my own art. It's called Sequoia. This is a Simpsonized Sequoia asking the viewer, Sherlock, Ye Jali no Heitan, Holkus. Do you understand Cherokee? Jiskoda.